Thank you all so much for joining us for this panel session during FEA Day, and happy FEA Day. This is something that we do at FEA every year in December because we feel like maybe people could use a little day where they just put some Zoom on, have some hot cocoa or tea next to them, and learn about an organization that, I'm not going to be modest, is as wonderful as ours. So thank you all for being part of this. I'm Angie Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of the Fund for Education Abroad. And the idea for this panel presentation came as a result actually of a few weeks ago. I was really fortunate and I was able to be part of the Pi Live in Boston event. It was a few weeks after the election, and someone in the audience asked a question about how organizations, how institutions are preparing students to go abroad. And immediately in the back, there were a couple of us that were talking about what it was like to be abroad when maybe there were some very interesting diplomatic or political things going on in the US and abroad. I happened to be abroad right after 9/11, and so I was talking a little bit about that. Other people were talking about what it was like to be abroad during the 2016 elections and preparing students, and also from working with students overseas, what it was like to watch some of them navigate the questions that they were receiving. And obviously, a lot of this is very dependent on the place, but I think it was a really good conversation starter, and that conversation thread lasted throughout the day at the Pi. So that's kind of the idea behind this. I wanted to give you all a little bit of information about the Fund for Education Abroad. I know I see a lot of our friends in the audience, but I also see a lot of new faces. So wanted to give you some info, and then we will jump right into our panel presentation. So the Fund for Education Abroad, we've been around since 2010, and we provide study abroad scholarships and ongoing to support students with financial need who have been historically marginalized and excluded in Ed Abroad. We are currently the only fully philanthropic, independent nonprofit doing this work with U.S. students nationwide. And we very much prioritize working with students who are people of color, first-generation college students, and community college students. We have more than 30 different scholarship funds. Some of them are based on where students are going abroad. Some of them are based on other demographics. Some of them are general scholarship funds. But our access partners are a really big part of the work that we do, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So thus far, to date, we've awarded over 1,200 scholarships, and they've totaled over 4.3 million. Thank you, Peter. I know, right? That's a big number. Our goal is in 2025 to fund 250 FEA scholars. So it's a big goal, but we're really excited to see where we get with the work we're putting in. And our team, it's just me and our senior program coordinator, Kaylee Henderson, who's here, and our program manager, Joelle. We have amazing interns, we have an amazing board, we have lots of volunteers, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation, how you might be able to get involved with FEA. But for a small team, I'm really proud of the work that we've done and the awards that we've received. So this is us, and you are welcome. We will be monitoring the chat during the panel presentation. Joelle and Kaylee and I can bring your questions to the forefront during the question phase of the panel presentation. These are the types of scholarships that FEA offers. We have general scholarships that are covered by our general fund. We have named and dedicated scholarships. Some of them have restrictions, like I said, on where students are going or demographic and identity factors. Others are very general, but our Access Partner scholarships are a huge part of the work that we do. And our Access Partners are all featured on this slide. The membership program from different organizations in the field, this really helps FEA to fund our core work of supporting students before, during, and after study abroad, and allows students going on these programs to have additional opportunities for scholarships and resources. So we could not do this work without our access partners, and that's why I wanted to feature their voices. One, keeps me and Kaylee and Joelle, who talk about all this all the time, from having to speak for another hour of the day. But also our access partners really have shown that they care so much about our scholars and are willing to do really anything to make sure that they feel supported and prepared for going abroad. And so I invited our access partners to be part of this conversation today, and you'll get to meet them in just a moment. And our access partner scholarships can be cash scholarships for students. They also might be tuition and accommodation waivers, which students also find very helpful. So if you have any questions about our access partner scholarships, we have lots of information on our website, but me, Joelle, and Kaylee are also happy to answer any questions you have. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Maureen Manning of the PI, who made my experience a few weeks ago possible and who's going to moderate today's discussion. Thank you all for being a part of this.
Thanks so much, Angie. And thanks everyone for joining. And, as Angie mentioned, get involved. And what are some different ways you can get involved? And one way is being here and spending this next hour with us today. So thanks so much for being here. And I encourage you to get involved in this conversation we're having by posting your comments and your questions for our panelists in the chat. I also want to say thank you to Angie and her team for organizing this event during FEA Day about such an important and timely topic, because as educational and organizational practitioners and leaders in the global education space, we're really at a pivotal moment, aren't we? We're standing at the crossroads of political transitions, and those transitions at home really do have a ripple effect when we go abroad. And the students who are preparing to go abroad, they're immersing themselves in new cultures, and they're not just travelers, but by default, they're ambassadors of the US. So today's conversation, again, is not just timely, it's necessary. So thank you, Angie and FEA, for organizing this and getting us all together to engage in this conversation. Some of the things we'll talk about today are how we equip students to carry that weight of navigating the complex political climates of their host countries and the US, how we guide them to grow, to thrive, and embrace these challenges, even as transitions unfold during their time abroad. So these questions all demand collective wisdom. So I'm very honored to moderate today's discussion and have leaders here on our panel who are engaged in this critical work. So before we dive into the conversation, I'd love for our panelists to introduce themselves. Sarah.
Thanks, Maureen. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Dart. I'm the Senior Vice President with Education in Ireland, which means I work with all of the Irish colleges and universities.
And you can jump right in here, panel. Shauna?
Thanks, Maureen. Hello, everyone. Great to see you all, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this really important panel today and celebrate FEA Day. Thank you, Angie and the team at FEA, for all that you do. I'm Shauna Parker. I am the VP of Communications and Strategic Engagement at CEA Kappa. And I will pass to Kate.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. My name is Kate McSurley. I've been working in my current role as Assistant Director of Health, Safety, and Risk Management at World Strides for the past 3 years, but I've been involved in the international ed community since 2011 in various roles and have seen various transitions throughout my time. And we'll pass to Sarah.
I've already gone. Maybe Graham, do you want to jump in?
Absolutely. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where in the world you are. My name is Graham Hesp. I am with FIE, the Foundation for International Education. I am one of our 4 US-based staff. We are a London-based study abroad organization with operations in London, Dublin, Madrid, and Barcelona. And I guess that means good morning, Natalie.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, atu i Aotearoa. So my name is Natalie Lulia, and I am the Acting Regional Director for the Americas, Middle East, and Europe. I am based usually in Washington, D.C., but I'm actually home in Aotearoa in the moment. So good morning to you all.
Thank you so much, panelists. And when we have these critical conversations, we want to not just address what the problems and the issues and the challenges are at hand, but also have a really strategy forward and solutions focused conversation. So I'm going to dive right in with that in mind and talk about strategies. So I'm going to put a question out to anyone and everyone on the panel. If you would like to share what strategies you found effective to date in helping students navigate questions or assumptions about US politics and culture.
I'll jump in. I think one of the key things is there may be a level of expectation that you're speaking for everyone, and it's okay to say, this is my viewpoint. And people don't necessarily understand the size of the US as well. And so there are major political differences between parts of California, between parts of New York. Even I'm in Illinois, between the Chicagoland area and where I am in Southern Illinois, there are major differences. So it's okay to start that conversation saying, the US is a very big country. You know, most of the UK would fit within the state of Illinois. And people don't realize that if they have not been to the US. So grounding some of that. Also, when we do political internships, especially in the UK, we have to actually get to the bottom of understanding somebody's political philosophy, because it's not just a matter of saying, oh, you're on a left-wing party versus a right-wing party, because they don't equally open up and lay on top of each other. So, for example, there tends to be more of an overlap between the left of center British Labour Party and the Democratic Party here in between the Conservative Party in the UK and the Democratic Party in the US. So you'd think if you just used the black and white left right, then it would be Labour, Democrat, Conservative, Republican. Well, Republicans are to the right of the Conservatives, but Labour, the Democrats kind of have that overlap. And so it does get a little tricky. So you can't just immediately think that everyone is speaking the same language either.
Thanks, Graham. Other strategies that you've used in the past during political turmoil or uncertainty when sending students abroad?
I'll
Sorry.
jump in. I'll jump in quick. I think it's a good point, that burden, that weight, that we've said that a few times already today, that students, when they go abroad, that they don't feel that they're overburdened with having to know all the fine print of our political system. I think it's fair to say that most people don't here. But I do think it's important to at least know the global perspective, or at least the global interest, and that they might have those questions asked. So having open discussion, that's one strategy, is making sure that students know that it's a possibility that they might have some interactions with questions that they haven't been asked before. And for that, maybe having some talking points prepared, just a few questions for them to consider if they are ever asked about their thoughts on a particular topic. We don't want them for the first time to ever hear about their, if they're Republican, Democrat, or somewhere in the middle, for that to be when they're working it out. So even if it's just a planned response on how to say that they don't know, or they haven't researched, or they can't speak confidently on a topic, that'll help them feel a little bit more confident in those particular situations, by just being able to have some sort of response. They might not be able to tell you a lot about Congress, but maybe they can use it as an opportunity to say that their focus is on American football. It could be an opportunity for them to have discussions that are important to them without being dismissive or flustered, and being able to have an open, safe communication with their host country.
Great strategies, great advice. Thanks so much. Other strategies, I knew there's some other people were jumping in there too. Panel?
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, I just think just following up, I agree completely with what my fellow panelists have said. And it's multifaceted because it also depends so much on what the student's studying, where they're studying. So the strategies that we might employ might look a little bit different depending on the chosen destination of that particular student. But I think regardless, it all comes down in a lot of ways to a lot of the things that studying abroad successfully comes down to, which is preparation and expectation setting of just really being sure from, the day that a student raises their hand and says, I want to go abroad, to the point where would they come home from that experience that we have set expectations for them. And that we've provided them with contextualization in terms of the cultures that they're going to be interacting with, and also used it as an opportunity for them to examine their own culture. Many students are going abroad with perhaps not a lot of political experience, which has been mentioned here, political understanding or geographical understanding even of their country that they're coming from. And so studying abroad also gives them the opportunity to examine and reflect on that more. And then I think a last thought is that, one of the things that CEA Kappa is very lucky to have is, in addition to people who come from the countries and cities that we're teaching and students are learning and living in, is a lot of expats and a strong alumni network. And that's something that we really lean into for complex topics like this.
Thanks so much, Shauna. As I look in the chat, and not the chat, but in the participants list, I noticed that not only do we have a deep level of expertise on our panel, but also in the audience. So I encourage and invite you to add your strategies as well as comments and questions, strategies that you have found successful in this space as well, and best preparing students. Some of the things that the panel has mentioned is a reality check and grounding the size of the US, staying away from absolutes, focusing on your own strengths and interests as conversation starters, and reminding them they do not have to be experts on the political nuances in their home country, and using it as an opportunity to reflect on their own ideas and opinions. Great strategies. Thanks so much, panelists. Speaking of that weight and that burden, though, that we keep coming back to, that idea, some students have that weight on them as being viewed as representative of all Americans whilst abroad. So how can we help prepare students for that possibility, or dare I say inevitability, of them feeling that they represent all Americans? Thoughts on that?
Oh, I might jump in on this one. And possibly too, because I think I do also have a personal, I guess, relationship to that, being a New Zealander, and actually being based in the US as well. So one, it is a function of my job because I do work for the New Zealand government, but also too, I am, when I go around the US, I'm also asked like many things about New Zealand, and I do feel this, I'm meant to be the expert on New Zealand, but I think one of the things I've learned, and something that I do share with students and actually anyone that's preparing to go abroad, is I think like what's been shared before, is putting things into context. And I do find that people are generally just curious, but their curiosities usually come from something like they've watched a TikTok, or like me, we watch a TikTok or we've seen something online. And so I think it's really just putting into context the fact that sometimes people ask questions out of curiosity, but also knowing that it doesn't necessarily always come with a lot of background. And so I think sometimes we can make some assumptions about what people know, or what we think they might already know about us. So I kind of look at those as learning opportunities, but also to on the flip side, so something that we do in Aotearoa New Zealand, or a concept that we use, which is drawn from, I guess, Māori practices, is this notion of being a good visitor and being a good host. And so those are manuhiri and haukainga, and essentially what you find in it. So we do this work with students usually before we get them prepared to go abroad, but also before we host delegations in New Zealand. And so we explore this notion of, well, what does it mean to be a good visitor in somebody else's place and space, but actually also too, what does it mean to be a good host? So it's that notion of asking intelligent questions, but also being mindful of where your question's coming from, and perhaps adding that to your explanation as to, one, why you might be asking it, or two, why it might asking people, in what context are you asking me this particular question? But I think also too, it was raised at the beginning, just saying, look, this is my point of view. It's not the view of everybody in my country, but this is my point of view based on my experience, background, and my, I guess, beliefs, and things like that. So just adding that in there for it to the mix.
I'm so glad you did, Natalie, and thanks so much for bringing up that place of curiosity where these questions and conversations often derive. So staying with that, can you give us some suggestions for how you can best balance or even encourage this cultural curiosity while at the same time ensuring student safety and respect for local norms?
Yeah, oh, sorry. I'll just quickly go again. Just on that one, I think, so in the New Zealand context, so if students are coming to New Zealand, New Zealand's generally quite very welcoming place. Everyone's super curious. And I think because we're quite far away from the rest of the world, when we do see someone from abroad, we want to ask them every single question about food and many things, including politics. But in terms of strategy, something that we also look at, and it's a very, I guess it's a very basic statement, but it says a lot of things, is one thing we do often talk to students about is the statement, don't yuck someone's yum. And it sounds very, like it's very basic, but actually it speaks to many different facets of not just kind of political views, but just views in general. And so, yeah, we have this conversation around, again, what does it mean to be a good visitor, a good manuhiri? What does it mean to be a good host, a haukainga? Is actually, what does it look like to not yuck somebody's yum? So yeah, that's a strategy that again we do look at around, yeah, I guess balancing that curiosity as well as, you know, being open enough to share and respect other people's worldviews.
Love that. Thank you, Natalie. Other thoughts?
I'll dive in
Yeah,
more,
Bram.
Maureen.
Yeah.
So we have a summer program that ends up in Jordan in the Middle East. And one of the things, I love that expression about yak your yum, but what we say is cultural differences, they are not wrong, they are different. And you need to acknowledge and understand that this is a different culture. And while a behavior may not be the norm or may not be acceptable in a North American perspective, that is kind of what is the norm in the Middle East. And it is not our job, it's not your job to then correct the locals to say what you're doing is wrong and you shouldn't be treating women that way. You should behave this way, because what they're doing is their norm. And going sort of back a question a little bit as well is understanding language and location. And what we see, especially with our students going to our programs in Spain, but also going to Jordan, is there is a greater expectation of cultural differences and greater planning that goes into going on a study abroad where the language is different. And what we find is the students who go to our programs in Dublin and in London oftentimes have a greater cultural shock because they think, oh, we speak the same language, everything is going to be exactly the same. And as somebody who is British and American, I can tell you, no, it's not. The original Oscar Wilde quote of divided by a common language is definitely still true to this day.
I love the Oscar Wilde quote and really insightful comments adding to this. Other thoughts about encouraging this cultural curiosity, but really balancing that with the respect for norms, or
Yeah.
thoughts from the audience?
I'll just pop in quickly. I think it has been said already, but just stressing respect. And that comes down to some things that might go without saying, but should be said. Asking permission for photos, for conversations, as Natalie mentioned too, being that good visitor and understanding that it's a privilege to be invited into that location, and not demanding answers necessarily, but allowing for quality conversations to develop. And that might be hard, especially at first when you're so excited and want to explore and know all the things, but perhaps just having some patience when learning about a new culture and community too.
So a lot of these conversations happening in your pre-departure meetings, in the student advising, what kind of resources do you use or approaches do you use to educate students about the political climate in their host country, especially during times of political transition?
Well, I'll just add and open it up to others. We always recommend having a quality news source that they can go to both before and while they're on program. So that go-to spot where they have it ready, that they can understand what is important for the local community according to the news, but also if there are changes in the political environment, that they know where to go and have a resource. And yes, pre-departure I think is so important, but having those check-ins throughout as well. Situations change, situations develop quickly, as we all just saw in South Korea. That was a whirlwind for everyone in our community. But having a resource, a reliable resource that they can go to, is so important.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks, Brooke, for your hi, Brooke, and thanks for your comment in the chat. And it speaks to that reality check that you led us off with, Graham, about grounding the size of the U.S. and that the diverse nature of the U.S. And Brooke adds, it's important to arm students with data and facts to help reinforce the truth that the U.S. is extremely diverse. So having that, and that goes along with your point, Kate, too, about having reliable news sources. So all pointing back to the importance of that data. So we're giving students lots of resources in these pre-departure meetings, but as you note, Kate, throughout their time abroad as well, which leads me to my next question is, based on your experiences, what are some of the most common challenges students face when they're studying abroad during times of political transitions, and how have you addressed them? Can you give us any case studies, any examples?
I think I would speak to, and I'd be interested to hear what Graham might think about this too. Many folks may know that in the north of Ireland, it is legally British, but culturally both British and Irish. We have many students that go there to study who often find themselves asked to not only speak for themselves as Americans, but to weigh in on the political situation in the north of Ireland. And even calling it the north of Ireland is a political choice, I suppose, but I mean that in a very neutral way. And we've talked to students who found themselves in trouble referring to the city of Derry or Londonderry as one or the other, and they catch interesting comments for that either way. And I've spoken with students, they didn't expect to be put on the spot in this way and asked to comment on their opinion of a country in which they are a visitor. So I think it's important students understand that they may get those kinds of questions as well. And to that, I think it's very important to have a sense for the place that you're going, and not just who is perhaps the leader of the country, but a bit about the history and what informs why things may be perceived in one way or another. And so it isn't just maybe the news, but it's also perhaps reading some books that were, set in that country, written by people from that country. Perhaps it's following certain influencers who kind of talk about what's going on in these areas. And I will say, I think that we do a media recommendation list, and it is books, TV shows, movies, podcasts. We don't have any influencers on there, but maybe we should, to give students lots of different, or visitors in general. We do this for our site visit visitors too, to give them a lot of options for understanding the country, because I think that context is important. And perhaps it's not fair to ask the student to comment on their thoughts of the politics of this country. That's not really their role, but to understand that they might be put in that position.
Thank you, Sarah. And I have been on the receiving end of that list of recommended reads and such from you before a trip to Belfast. So thank you very much for providing that. Like you said, not only to students, but to faculty, to providers, to other stakeholders who are visiting the country, because it is extremely helpful to know some of the context. Again, not that we have to participate or weigh in on someone else's political the nuances of someone else's political system in another country, but that we have some background information. So
I think
thoughts? Yeah, Graham.
2025 is going to be really interesting because we obviously had the 2016 election, and to some extent, President Trump was an outlier. But over 2024 and going into 2025, the vast majority of the democratic world has had elections this year, and more of the governments are becoming right-leaning, whereas Trump was the outlier. And so I think in 17, 18, 19, students may have received questions about, what did you do? How did you elect somebody like that? Yet now I think that I don't know. We'll wait and see. But there may be more of a belief and a respect and understanding for President Trump Mark II, because most of those other governments have now also become right-leaning as well, the UK being the outlier that actually went from right to left. But most of the other elections that have occurred this year have gone further right. So I think there will be an interesting dynamic that will be occurring there.
Yeah, and as you say, Graham, wait and see. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, Angie, I hope you have us back next FEA Day a year later and find out, some more of these stories that we're hearing from students about their experiences abroad, about what people are talking about, what they're asking them about. Time will tell, as Graham has wisely said.
I'll send a save the date for the retrospective. But this is, I mean, these are questions that FEA scholars were even bringing up in our interviews with them prior to the election, and that we've heard from quite a few of them about, like, how do I answer questions, especially if they're coming from a minoritized population in the US too. So it really is a very interesting point you make, Graham. And also Brian pointed out in the chat that something like 78% of democratic elections took place worldwide, potentially. So lots of change worldwide, not just here.
So lots of questions coming up, or this type of conversation coming up in the interviews of late, Angie. What about some success story panelists or audience members? Can you share any success stories or examples that you have from students on your programs who have thrived despite challenges based on what we're discussing here today?
I'll jump in again with two examples. Obviously, the fact that we have a program that is looking at conflict and a quest for peace and starts in Ireland, does go to Derry/Londonderry, and that's a classic. You right away know somebody's politics, religion, depending on how they call that city, but then ends up in Jordan. And when I was with the students in 2016, they were obviously talking about the 2016 upcoming election. And I've no idea what their political beliefs were, but every single one of them said, when Hillary gets elected, this is what will be happening with American State Department and foreign policy. And of course, that didn't happen. But both in that entire program, because it's the quest for peace, and there is no simple black and white answer, but also when I used to teach in London our ethical leadership course, both of them use a Socratic method of teaching without any answers. And yes, in the moment, the students hate it. And they will constantly be saying, but what's the answer? Just tell me what I need to put on the final. And in both our course for conflict and peace, and in that particular course I was teaching about ethical leadership, we've just pushed back and get them to wrap their minds around the impossible questions. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think students today are even more so just looking for the answer so they can move on to the next question, the next course, the next year in school, whatever it might be. And I think we need to be prepared to challenge them. And when I started this crazy path in higher education, there used to be the whole thing of higher education is when you struggle and make mistakes, and we're going to be there to catch you and pick you up. And we've kind of gone to the idea of just make it easy for them to move on to graduation. And I think we perhaps need to make a step back and to say, it's okay to feel uncomfortable, to feel challenged, and not like the situation you're in, because as we know from years and years of higher education research, that's when the true learning occurs.
Beautifully said. And important to remind students that this is not the first time that there has been, political division in the U.S. with people with, who have been starkly divided on topics. And Catherine brings up a great point in the chat that I wasn't thinking about, but now that you bring it up, coming from Reagan's America. And studying abroad during that time, and the criticisms of the U.S. that were happening then. So I appreciate you bringing that up and reminding us that this is not the first time, nor will this be the last. And, Graham, as you mentioned, and Matt in the chat, about so many elections happening worldwide. So certainly U.S. students are not the only students who are going abroad and having to grapple with these types of questions, nor is it something new to them, but also very important to have these discussions. And as Catherine mentioned, wishes, she had these types of resources. There were no Zooms back then where we could have these kinds of conversations. So thank you for engaging in these conversations with us today. Earlier in our conversation, I think both Shauna and Kate, you've mentioned about the importance of reflection and using these international opportunities as a time for reflection. So can we dig into that a little bit more? So what about reflection activities, and what role do they have in addressing these challenges that we've been discussing today? And how do you recommend they go about that?
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, I think as we think about this, it's really multifaceted. We're living in a very complex global political environment, but most of our students going abroad are coming from a very particular cultural context of their own, and they may or may not have that broader global political context or geographical context. And so, being in a new place and having to, as Graham mentioned, the differences of politics, say for a student living in the UK versus the US, can be very confusing. The spectrums can be very different. And so, as we think about, the outcomes that we want our students to come back with, some of these are the ability to think more critically, right? Like we have these student learning and development outcomes, things that we very specifically created as frameworks for students that work throughout our curriculum, not just within the classroom, but outside of the classroom and co-curricular activities as well. And critical thinking is part of that. And I think when we think about creating that ability for reflection and the understanding of complexity, some of that is that ability to think critically. and to really unpack and examine things. And I think this is an opportunity really for us to partner with our faculty, partner with those who are creating our curricula, to imbue those syllabi, that curricula, the teaching and learning with some of the elements of the cultural complexity of the current culture, of what's happening now geopolitically. And creating ways for students, you know, through that experiential learning cycle, to be able to go out and have an experience and test things out and ask questions and be open to those questions, and then come back and maybe think about it more reflectively, think about it more critically in those contexts, and then do that over and over again as they move through that study abroad journey.
Thanks so much, Shauna. Other
Yeah.
thoughts about that reflective piece?
Yeah, I'll just add, combining what we heard from Graham and Shauna, that, you know, give me the answer. What do I say? How do I respond? And that's the work, right? Having the conversation, that's the real work. And it's confronting, but being able to have an opportunity in a safe or a brave space for students to work through those feelings. And again, well, how do I even feel about this myself? I've never asked that to myself before. And having a trial run before they go into a public setting can arm them with that confidence and the words, the language that they can use. We also heard from Graham about how studying in an English speaking country gives you that false sense of security. And sometimes the words are so important to be able to not misspeak, not be misunderstood, and know how your language can differ from your host. And the same goes for those who are speaking in a different language. How can they use the vocabulary that they know, or how do they feel comfortable speaking in their host location, so they're not misinterpreted or their intent is not misunderstood.
Fantastic. Are there anything else on the reflective piece? We've got a great comment in the chat about the importance of collaboration. And I want to, that Peter has mentioned, having a strong network or cohort when possible is key. So Peter, I'm not sure, are you talking about practitioners?
Lots of different ways to slice that open, and most of I sort of ping pong in my international education career of working with Americans going outside of the US and international students in the US or wherever. But right now I'm working with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and I work with Mozambican clinicians that are studying in Brazil. And Mozambique had a terrible election recently, when the government's shutting off electricity, they're shutting off the internet. Students, the fellows in my program can't always regularly be in touch with family. So it's really like the fact that they're a cohort, they are just such a support for each other. And yes, you know, they're there for the international aspect of training, but having that foundation, there's real success in the fact that they're there together.
So a professional cohort or collaboration. Thanks so much for bringing that up. And I want to put that out to our panel as well, and ask you and challenge you to answer, how can we better collaborate as a field to develop shared resources, some of these which we're talking about today, or best practices for addressing these issues. And I know that there's some real innovative work that's been going on with the forum and otherwise. So your thoughts on what Peter has shared regarding professional collaboration. Anyone in the panel?
I'll hop in. I was trying to give a minute, but I think, you know, nourishing our collective communities, attending the webinars like this one today, and saying yes when invited to have these conversations, I think is so important. So we're continuing to ask each other questions, learning from each other, and not seeing as our collaboration as a disadvantage, being open to our forums in all the ways that we see, because we know that we rise as a field together, and our motivation should always be with sharing our successes. So those struggles and those hurdles can be overcome together. It sounds so kumbaya, but I think it really is as a global community, and what we're trying to do here and trying to achieve. I think we have to sort of do as we say as well, and be open to criticisms as well if we're doing something that is not supporting a more global community and good global citizens. But participating, going in the chats, if that's where your comfort is too. I love that. I learned so much from attending sessions like this, where someone might not be ready to unmute, but they have so much to say. And I think sharing that is so important.
I think also to Peter's point, I'm just going to jump in. Something that at FEA that we do is we try to pair students up with mentors. And it doesn't mean that it's somebody who is currently abroad. It's somebody who's probably already been abroad. And maybe they share an identity, maybe a part of their identity, maybe they share the country where they studied. But one thing that I'm very curious about with this next spring 2025 cohort is these students, many of them are leaving in January and will come back to a US that they're not really sure what it's going to be like. And we've talked with a few scholars about that. And so to Peter's point about the importance of feeling like you're part of sort of this cohesive collective in some way, right? It may not be that it's other students in your host country, but I'm thinking about the re-entry side of things for this cohort going abroad in spring, and when they're back in May, June, July, what it's going to be like for them to come back into the US, and are they going to, that they will have this unique opportunity to connect with each other on what that's like to come home after being abroad during such a, I think it's going to be, as Graham mentioned, very, very interesting spring politically, both here in the US and globally. So that importance of feeling like they have someone to process that with, I think is something maybe we're not talking enough about as a field.
I think that's great, Angie, and goes along with that. What are your strategies around reflection, particularly in the reentry piece of the student journey? And as I think Kate mentioned earlier, like thinking of that, the entire journey, and not just when they come back or preparing students to leave, but making sure we have those touch points along the way during their experience. But yes, will be interesting to hear what those reflections are. And I think that's part of our circle back next year that you put on the calendar. So curious to hear the student perspectives from that. Brian has
one big
go ahead,
thing so in 2013, FIE started our Student Global Leadership Conference based out of London. It is now annual. It is always grounded in our core values. And this year's conference is actually, I had to look it up, Inclusive Leadership, because every good title has to have a colon.
Absolutely.
Establishing cultural connections and challenging stereotypes. And what's nice is it's not just for FIE students. We open it up to anyone in the study abroad community in London, the greater UK. We have British students. We have students traveling over from mainland Europe. And for the last couple of years, we've also partnered with AIFS and the Cyril Taylor Foundation. And so it truly is a turning into a education abroad student-based conference. And so anyone who is, you have students studying in the London area, then April 4th and 5th, amazing opportunity to connect with other study abroad students, but also British students and other international students as well, held at the Royal Geographical Society in Kensington in London.
Sounds like a fantastic event, and an FEA student headed your way for that conference, at least one. Terrific. I know the forum, and Sarah, you've been deeply involved in the work of the forum as far as creating resources to that answer some of these questions, as well as many others. So I just wanted to throw that piece out there, as well as using the forum as a resource. And I don't know if you wanted to mention some of the work that you're involved with there.
I mean, the forum, I think, is an incredible resource for all sorts of areas. Well, I've been involved in a lot of the work around employment and hiring and team building and that sort of thing, perhaps less relevant to this conversation, some of the work I've particularly been involved in. But I would really like to mention on the piece about collaboration, the work of the associations in country. I know these exist all over Europe. In Ireland, we have ASAPI, the Association of Study Abroad Providers in Ireland, and most of the countries have some sort of equivalent body, the countries that receive large numbers of US students. And it's folks from the provider organizations, resident directors, often folks who work at the universities who work with the US students. And I think this is a very underutilized resource. These folks are experts in the local culture, perhaps in the politics. And I think there's an incredible opportunity for us to be leveraging that knowledge and the networks they have too. Angie made a comment in the chat about how students' identities also often impact their experience abroad and the point of cohorts. And, your program may be small, but there probably are a number of other programs in the city or in the region. And perhaps if a student is looking for a support network, maybe it isn't through someone in your program, but it's through somebody in the IFS program or the USAC program or wherever else. And that network, I think, is very useful for helping to tap into that, even aside from their vast expertise about their local countries.
Great resource.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to
Yeah.
Sarah just this just how we can I guess collaborate and work together. I think is just not taking for granted that what we might know that others already know as well. Like I think sometimes we can make a lot of assumptions, and particularly I guess from our perspective as Education New Zealand, it actually is quite easy for us to be able to share a number of different, lots of information about studying abroad, but actually also around what's going on with our country. So something I've noticed in the last year I've been in the US is a lot of people don't know that we've also, our country's also been through a recent political transition as well in October 2023. Some people know about it, but actually other people still think our previous Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is still the Prime Minister, but she actually hasn't been a Prime Minister for 2 years in our country. So I think just that, actually intentionally scheduling time, regularly through the year to actually catch up with your providers or those that you work closely with, to what Sarah's talking about, and making sure that, any information that we have, that we're passing it on, but also too that we build the level of relationship that we can actually just flick a message and say, hey, I've seen XYZ. Do you have any insight on this? Is there anything that we should be sharing with our students or, and wherever they might be going? And so I think just that opportunity to keep dialogue going, because again, the more we know, then the more we can impart on our students, and that they can then be prepared. But I think too, just in regards as well to that wider piece on reflection is, there is nothing more powerful than somebody who knows who they are. And I think that's what our experiences provide, is this like supercharged environment to explore the depths of who one is. And so not only are they answering questions about what everyone else wants to know, but they're also trying to unpack for themselves, well, what are my values and how do I feel about what I'm seeing? Or actually, okay, I've seen the world from my point of view in my home, in my place in space. How do I share that? And also too, then how do I take what I've learned and share that back with others? And I think to the other point around, some people like being on the chat and others like kind of to talk and share, is looking at reflection in many different ways. So not just some people will write in a diary and others might speak to others, but I do strongly encourage students, talk to your friends, tell them, this is what happened today and this is what it made me think about and this is what I'm reflecting on, or, talking to parents or even, just talking to there's other international students from other parts of the world when you go and study too. So, you know, hey, what are you guys thinking about this? Did you see, you know, this thing went on? You know, what are you thinking, and what does it look like in your country? And I think that's it. It's you don't have to be the expert on it, but also there's others who are also trying to not be the expert on something as well. And so it's just finding that common ground together that, hey, here's what I'm thinking based on, you know, this is kind of how I've grown up and the things I've seen. But likewise, you're learning things about other people and the way they see the world as well. Because, yeah, I think, like we all know, my perspective is my perspective, but it's one of, you know, 8 billion perspectives that are not right or wrong. They're just perspectives and their way we see the world. And I think it's just, yeah, putting it in that bigger context as well, which I think is super helpful.
Powerful reflections, Natalie. An important reminder of the importance of differentiating opportunities for reflection for students and practitioners, based on, you know, our own experiences as how we best process, and remembering that students likewise process things in a very different way, and allowing multiple forms of reflection for them to have these important conversations. Also, I mean, yes, great quote. There's nothing more powerful than someone who knows who they are. Really have the goosebumps here in Boston. Really powerful quote. And we've gotten some really great quotes today in our hour together, from Yucking Your Yum to Oscar Wilde and everything in between. So I want to thank all of the panelists for engaging in this conversation with us today, as well as the wonderful conversations that we've had in the chat. I'm even noticing some questions and answers going on in the chat too, with Angie asking, you know, about identity and strategies around that. Brian has some great answers to that too, that I actually copied and pasted because I didn't want to lose it once I closed out this session. So thank you for your conversations today with us and with each other in the chat. I want to turn it over to Angie now to close things up and let us know what's next for FEA Day and what can we expect in 2025.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all. Your perspectives are incredibly valuable, and I feel like I'm very hopeful. I think that the field has come a long way since, I think when I was studying abroad, the only mention of politics in my pre-departure orientation was, don't go to any protests. It's dangerous. So I'm glad to hear we've come. I think students are generally able to access information more, but it is that connection that was such a theme of this, I think is a really important part of that process of reflection, not just for the students, but for us to learn from them. So speaking of learning from students, we have our applicant webinar next. We're going to be talking with students who are applying in this application cycle. Our application is currently open for summer, fall, and full academic year scholarships, and the deadline will be in February. And we, because we are a small but mighty, but not quite that mighty team, we really need volunteer reviewers. We rely on usually between 85 and about 110 volunteer reviewers to get through every application cycle. If any of you all are interested in reading student stories and learning more about FEA Scholars, I have a feeling politics are probably going to creep up into some of these essays in some really interesting ways. We invite you to be a reviewer. So I believe Joelle can put that in the chat, the link to sign up for that if you're interested. I think also, you know, this group of folks on this call probably has their finger on the pulse of students going abroad, but our FEA Scholar blogs and blogs are always on our website to check out. And it's really great to see sometimes the student growth and, you know, be reminded of that iceberg culture shock graphic that we all have known to come and love. But we see that actually play out in their blogs, and they do often write about the politics of the countries they're in and how eye-opening the experience is to be overseas for them. So I encourage you all to check those out. We have events virtual and in person. We usually have a NAFSA event. We have our gala every November. So we would love to see you all at those events. If you have an info session about scholarships or anything coming up and you'd like FEA to be a part part of it, please be in touch with us. We'd love to talk with your students. And we have an FEA flyer on our website if you would like to put that on, if you're working at a campus or you have students you're working with that you think would be interested and served well by our scholarship, please feel free to share information about FEA with them. And thank you all again so much. I think this was a really great and kind of needed grounding conversation, maybe going into a year of unknowns for a lot of us. Maureen, thank you so much for moderating our panelists. You all are amazing. We really appreciate our access partners who make this work possible. So thank you all. Peter starting protests in 1999. And yes, feel free to put any questions in the chat. Yes, we can stop the recording, Joelle.